I don't mind saying I hate that moment when routing. That moment where you stop the router, but it takes an absolute age to wind down. And I know you could easily put it down on the battery, if your router is actually battery powered, but that is a lot of spinning bits still exposed. There are solutions already in place, holding it away from you while it stops, a few well-placed blocks, or maybe if you're really careful and a good aim, hitting a dog hole perfectly. Maybe not. But jokes aside, even if you don't make what I'm about to show you piece for piece, there will definitely be a few cool takeaways along the way. Because, well, I'm planning on over-engineering it from the get-go. And this video is sponsored by Squarespace. And I want to add some really unique features, but we're going to get to those in a minute. The basic idea to start with, well, the basic idea is pretty simple. I want to make something that raises the router, and therefore the bit, off the workbench while it comes to a stop. Kind of like a shelf or a mini table, or better still, a French cleat shelf, so I can put the whole thing away at the end after I've finished. And it doesn't have to be pretty either. My others aren't, if you really look carefully. And if you haven't guessed yet from past videos, I'm going to be making a prototype in the hope that it works well enough to be the finished product. We'll see. But if it does work, and I get to add the features that I want to add, I think you're going to really love it. There is a little overkill coming in right from the very start here. Most builds like this are made from plywood. Mine's no different. They're held together with wood glue and a few brad nails. It's really simple, and it's kind of nice to look at. But I have to go the extra step, or at least I've convinced myself I do because I don't have a brad nailer. So for speed and an instant bond, I'm going to use CA glue, and then for the longer term hold, wood glue. And here's the overkill. Because I'm impatient, I'm also going to throw some screws in. And yes, in case you missed it, I just made my first mistake. I measured once and I cut, well, not quite twice, but I cut wrong. You'll never know. Unless you're watching this right now, which I guess you are, so you will know. Anyway, for the screws, I'm just going to use this Amana countersink bit that I showed you in a video a while ago. And what you're seeing now is not sped up. This is the fastest way to drill and countersink ready for screws. I'll leave a link in the description for you. So now, as you can see, we've got a shelf. And if right now you're looking for the simplest way to solve a problem, just make the next few cuts for the router bit to sit in, and you're done. Problem solved. Me? I can't help myself. I want to be able to put this router back on its stand without really looking. So I need some extra blocks to guide the router into its seated position. This will basically avoid that spinning bit from hitting the sides on its way in. And I don't know if I have to say this, but I will anyway. I'm not making this so I can put the router down and leave it on. That would be silly. Don't do that. I'm just allowing it to be somewhere safer while it slows down to a stop once I've killed the power. And it may sound like a little bit of overkill for those experienced makers watching, but if you watched a video I did a while back, a bit actually came loose while the router was in my router table and it bored its way up through the wood. And I don't mind admitting that made me a little bit nervous, so you'll understand why I'm doing this. Plus, I'm having fun, and that's really important too. So now the router can be seated easily. That's step one done. Like I said, if you've got 1 hour to spare and this is a problem you want to solve, you're done. But when it comes to storage, a shelf is okay, but if you turn that shelf into a floating drawer, then you're not taking up any extra space really, but you're gaining a huge amount more storage. If you always try to think in 3D when you're looking at your tool wall, treat it as a box about a foot deep for the whole span of your wall, then suddenly you're going to see a lot of unutilized space ready to be used for storage. And as an aside, you're about to see the worst drawer ever made. Ever. But before we get to that, I'm going to show you the coolest part of this build. And I'll tell you about the steps that I'm doing to make it, but I'm going to wait till the end to tell you exactly what it does. First job is just to thicken the base out with an extra block of ply. I need to drill a hole directly below the router bit, because I've got this long bolt and a long hexagonal nut. That long nut is quite vital for extra rigidity, and everything I'm doing here is to try and drill as square as I possibly can. And this drill guide block is perfect for that if you don't have a drill press. A bit of chisel work gets the nut to sit perfectly, and then just check for square. And it's very important that you are close as you can get here for the next bits to work. And don't judge me on the use of CA glue here. Epoxy would probably be better because it's not as brittle and it would fill some of the gaps, but CA glue's all I've got. And then one of the last things you need to make is a cap. Mine's just a couple of round laser cut discs with a small nut embedded into one of them. But you could use any block here. I've just glued the discs together and these will eventually sit on top of that long bolt. If you want to test that the nut is fairly square within the first disc, just give it a spin and take a look to see if there's any wobble. But as we've not glued it yet, I'm going to show you another way of squaring it off in a second. But first, a moment to talk about the sponsor of this week's video. Now, I've spoken a lot about how great Squarespace have been to allow someone like me with limited skills to be able to design and create their own website. But did you know that they also have tools available to help you create and sell your own online courses? I've spoken before about the customizable layout and the ability to upload your own engaging content. But you can also set up the payment for the course through Squarespace as well. Just knowing that the capability to do so is there for when I decide to branch out is a huge asset. Not only that, but I can also sell products, plans, I can control my inventory and so much more. You can manage invoicing and payments all in one place too. So it's so much more than a super user-friendly website making system. It's a home base for everything my business needs. I've had a Squarespace site for 2 years before this sponsorship even began. And the reason for that is they take care of all the technical stuff so I can focus on improving my woodworking skills. So visit squarespace.com for your free trial now. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/startmaking for 10% off your first purchase of domain or website. Now, let's finish the coolest part of this build. But first, how not to make a drawer. In fact, let's just say, if you're going to do this, make a drawer that fits the gap. Doesn't matter how you do it. My plan was to nail and glue a simple butt joint box and then glue the base on the bottom. I didn't measure it right, it didn't turn out like I wanted it to, and I'm going to show you the mess of a drawer I've made a little bit later on. I mean, we're talking gaps, screws, shims, the whole 9 yards. And at this point, I think at this point I can barely call it a drawer. Anyway, back to our long bolt. It's slightly too long and I need to cut the last inch off. And here's a very quick tip. Before you start cutting with your hacksaw and filing all the jagged edges off the end, put the nut on. So when you've finished and the remaining thread is a little chewed up, when you take the nut off, it'll reset it to an extent. Now we've got to check that the long bolt and the cap actually works. And this is the best time and the easiest way to square that cap off before you glue the nut in. Draw the bolt down as far as you can go so the cap is then flush with the base of your shelf. And now adjust it until it's perfectly flat. And that's as close as I'm ever going to get it. And it turns out it fits almost perfectly. It does actually genuinely look like I've nailed it here, but if you look closer, you'll see that I've slid the base across just a bit so everything aligns. 85% perfect. To adjust the height of this cap, you turn the thread, and to make that easier, you could just use a star knob. I happen to have this round offcut left over from a past project, so I'm just going to glue that in place with a bit of hot glue, and when you press the thread through, well, you're going to realise that's a bit of an error. I did eventually get the nut to bite and used it to lock everything down tightly. Use whatever you want to turn this base here. You could even use a drill. And now, for better or worse, I've glued and screwed the bottom onto the shelf. Let's really hope I don't need to take this apart anytime soon. You don't need to do that. So much overkill. Making jigs like these, if that's what you want to call them, never has to be 100% perfection. However this turns out from this point onwards, it is a huge upgrade to what I was doing before. Oh yeah, and what's the thing you always lose for your router? Yeah, the spanner. Well, not anymore. Not with these super strong magnets to hold it in place underneath the shelf. Unless I actually forget it's under there. Then I'm never seeing it again. But now, well, now I go down my ever familiar rabbit hole. Because it's become apparent that the prototype has actually become the finished item. Which is good, but it doesn't mean it's actually as well made as I probably would have got on the second go. So, how can I make this look like it's not just some scrap ply thrown together? That's right, some grain-matched pallet hardwood. One part to hide the drawer front and the other as an end grain hiding panel. I also added on some of my laser cut French cleat brackets. But don't worry, if you don't have a laser and you can't cut your own brackets, if you very quickly look back at the start, I actually left a 3/4 inch gap behind the back of this shelf so you could fit a regular French cleat on there. So here it is. Something's not right. Can you spot it? You can put the router on and the drawer fits. Oh yeah, but you can no longer put it on your workbench. That's a bit of an issue. And I will tell you the truth, this didn't occur to me until right now. I kid you not. But that's okay. I just made some super simple legs. And now it's a tiny table. And the space on the side, well, that's for the only other base that I use for my router, the plunge base. And in case you haven't guessed, please let me tell you about the reason I added the threaded part. The biggest weakness with this particular router is how hard it is to actually set the depth. The plunge base is excellent, but on the normal base, when you use either a T-square or a ruler or the depth gauge, it's really hard to then lock it off and not have any movement that then ruins your accuracy. So my idea is simple. Use the depth gauge to set the cap by turning the threaded rod, then place the router on the stand with the bit fully inside the base, then loosen the base, drop the router until the bit hits the cap, and then lock it off, and there you are. Super simple and accurate. Well, not quite. I made a design mistake here, and for one reason or another, the cap doesn't actually sit beneath the bit. I don't know why, but that's okay. I just removed the battens, made the hole a little bit bigger, re-glued the battens on a little bit further back, and then glued the router to the shelf. The last part is not really part of the plan, so maybe skip that step. Anyway, now it works. The shelf sits beautifully on the French cleat wall, making the most of the space due to the drawer. It looks pretty due to the pallet wood on the front, and that also hides a lot of the errors. You can adjust the depth the bit sits at the wall itself, where all the other router bits are next to it, or simply take it down and have it on the bench while you work. Handy hint, put the space for the router on the side where it will most easily fit, depending on which is your dominant hand, and of course how you hold the router. And a second hint, add a French cleat to your workbench. Now the jig takes up no room at all. I love how this turned out, but I've really got to show you the drawer. Just for a laugh. And I guess to show people that it's okay to fail and just embrace it. Functional can be more than enough. It doesn't have to be perfect, although with this massive gap here, it's not actually exactly functional. So I added a block. And how did I get that gap? Well, that's a long story. And yes, I didn't show you the sketchy way that I made the drawer smaller because I'd measured wrong and forgot that I had to add the base on, so it was never going to fit in the hole where the drawer was supposed to live. But yeah, I used the table saw to try and make it shallower, and it was a terrible idea. Turns out it wasn't such a long story after all, but I'm still not showing you it. But I'm going to give you one more cool little benefit of this setup. Let's say you're routing out a series of dados, all the same depth. It's too deep to do it all in one pass. So you're constantly adjusting your router between half depth and final depth. Before I made this jig, that could have led to some loss of accuracy on each of the final depths. It's rare that you're going to get it exactly the same each time. But now you can. Simply set the depth, and then for the half depths, use a shim or two. The cap is always then there for the final pass. But I hear the eagle-eyed ones amongst you tapping away your comments. There is another issue to bypass here, because in normal use of this jig, what I suggest you do is you set the depth of your bit, and then before you use the router, you just drop the cap by a couple of turns. That way, when you're waiting for the bit to slow down after you've turned the router off and you set it back on the base, it's not going to chew the cap up. But if you're doing multiple dados, and you need the cap to stay in one place, but you still need to safely put your router on, well, that's simple. Set the final depth using a shim. Set the half depth with another couple of shims on top. That way, when you set the router back in, the cap's out of the way, and you can use the same shim to set the final depth each time. You could use setup blocks if you really wanted to. And the beauty is you could store all of that in the drawer next to it. Oh yeah, and I might be a little bit paranoid about taking this off every time I finish with a tool. But if you feel the same way, just ensure that you place the shelf back so that there's not enough height to put the router and the battery in, and you'll always have to take the battery off. I said at the start that experienced people may not see the need to solve any of the issues that I've tried to solve in this video. But genuinely, there's nothing wrong with feeling nervous when using a tool, so long as that teaches you to respect the tool rather than fear it. We all tend to walk that fine line. And I just want to say, if you've come to this part of the video, thank you so much. If you're not subscribed, please consider it. If you are subscribed, I appreciate every single one of you. Videos like this are genuinely what I enjoy doing, and if you've enjoyed this video, Worth checking out any one of these two. Thank you so much for your time. I'll see you over there.